This is completely unacceptable. I want this situation resolved immediately. Do you understand me?
The crisp clink of silverware against fine china echoed through the empty corners of the Manhattan restaurant. Maya Fields moved swiftly between tables, her black apron a stark contrast to the polished luxury around her. The room was nearly empty for the late hour, save for one table. Charles Donovan sat alone. He was the sort of man whose presence filled any space, not with warmth, but with a cold, commanding force. The CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech empire, known just as much for his ruthless business practices as for his steely, emotionless demeanor. Maya had heard the rumors how he toyed with his employees, how he built his empire at the expense of those around him, but she didn't think it would ever matter to her, not until tonight. Maya stopped by his table, her practiced smile in place, though her heart wasn't in it. "How's everything tonight, Mr. Donovan?" His cold eyes lifted from the menu, scanning her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "It's fine," he said, voice flat. He placed the menu down on the table, folding it carefully before turning his gaze back to her. "I need you to come to my apartment." The words hit her like a slap. "Excuse me." His stare didn't waver. "My penthouse. Right upstairs. You're to come to my bedroom." Maya blinked, taken aback. I'm not sure what you mean." He leaned back in his chair, unfazed. "I'm paying you for your time. I need you in my bedroom now." Maya's pulse quickened. She had been a waitress in high-end places before, had dealt with rich, demanding customers. But this was different. There was something in the way he said it, demanding, commanding, without any room for question. She wanted to refuse, to walk away. But the weight of his stare, the power he held over her, made it impossible to move. He leaned forward, his voice lowering. "Don't make me repeat myself." She hesitated, the room spinning. There were so many thoughts, so many reasons she should say no. But she didn't. She knew it wasn't about his words, but the silent pressure that came with them. She was a waitress, a woman of color in a world that didn't always see her, and he was the kind of man who could make a career disappear with a single phone call. Maya felt a tight knot form in her stomach. Slowly, she nodded. "Yes, Mr. Donovan." Right away, the elevator ride felt long, though it was only a few seconds. Maya didn't know why she went, why she didn't speak up, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As the elevator doors opened, she was greeted by the sleek, cold walls of his penthouse. It was all chrome, glass, and expensive art, an image of success that didn't match the gnawing feeling in her gut. When she reached the bedroom door, her hand hovered over the handle. A faint unease lingered in the back of her mind. What was she doing here? Why had she agreed? But before she could think too much, the door swung open. The sight that met her wasn't the one she expected. Charles Donovan lay sprawled on the floor, his face contorted in pain. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. The icy facade he'd worn so icily in the restaurant had shattered. He was no longer the commanding CEO. He was just a man helpless, vulnerable. Maya's heart skipped a beat. Her instincts screamed at her to help, but a thick silence filled the room. She was standing on the edge of something she hadn't prepared for. Her fingers froze over her phone, unsure whether to call an ambulance or risk being dragged into something she didn't understand. She knelt beside him, her mind racing. She could feel the heat of his skin, his shallow breaths, and the overwhelming weight of the moment pressing down on her. The man who had demanded her presence, who had manipulated and controlled, was now at her mercy. Maya's thoughts were a jumble. Should she help? Should she leave? Was this her responsibility? The door clicked shut behind her, leaving her alone with him. The room felt colder than it ever had before. She stood there, caught between the command she had just obeyed and the life or death decision before her. The only sound was the slow, painful breaths of a man who had once seemed untouchable. And for the first time, Maya was the one in control. The sterile walls of Charles Donovan's penthouse seemed to close in on Maya. The sharp, clean edges of the glass and chrome decor made the apartment feel like a showroom, not a home. She stood in the doorway of his bedroom, unsure of what to do. The tension between her own hesitation and the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on her. The man lying on the floor before her, the one who had demanded her presence without a hint of concern for her comfort, was now utterly vulnerable. His breath was shallow, uneven. In that moment, Charles wasn't the billionaire CEO. He was just a man in pain, alone, and possibly at the edge of life or death. Her pulse quickened. She could turn and leave. She could pretend it never happened. It would be easy. She had every reason to walk away, to let someone else take charge, but that wasn't who Maya was. She glanced down at him. His once imposing figure now seemed fragile, the powerful man reduced to something raw and human. Maya's mind flickered back to her life, her roots, those memories of growing up in a working-class neighborhood, a world far from this one. It wasn't a place where power or wealth were handed out easily. It was a place where survival meant taking responsibility for what mattered. She had grown up caring for her younger siblings, keeping food on the table, making sure they didn't feel the weight of their circumstances. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the dream she had hoped for, but it was her reality. She had learned early on that no one could afford to be passive. The world wouldn't wait for you to be ready. It demanded you act, even when it wasn't fair. Maya's thoughts flashed back to her job, to the restaurant, and to the constant subtle ways she was reminded of her place in this system. As a black woman in a predominantly white high-end restaurant, she had learned to be invisible when needed, to keep her head down and avoid making waves. She had endured the quiet, everyday racism that people like Charles never had to think about. It wasn't personal for him. For her, it was everything. The disparity between their worlds hit her now, as sharp as the pain in his breaths. Maya had been raised to survive. Charles had been raised to dominate. Her eyes roamed over the sterile bedroom. Everything about it felt calculated, untouched. Even the air seemed perfect. There was a distance between her and the reality of this space, a reminder that people like him didn't need help. They just needed control. But now, Charles was as helpless as anyone else. A small picture on the wall caught Maya's eye. It was a black and white photo of a much younger Charles, standing beside a woman, possibly his mother, both smiling. There was a certain innocence to the image, a stark contrast to the cold, distant man who had ordered her here. The picture spoke of a past that no longer existed, a time before the wealth, before the isolation, before the walls. The photo was a reminder that even men like Charles were once children, once full of hope. Now, he was just a man, sick, alone, and helpless on the floor of a room that symbolized everything he had built. A room that had no place for kindness, only power. Maya felt the pull of her decision. She could leave. It would be easy, but she could also stay. For a moment, she stood there, weighing her options. The door was still open behind her. She could walk out and go back to her life, back to her job, back to the familiar routine. It would be simple. It would be what was expected. But Maya had never lived a life of simple choices. And right now, the choice wasn't about Charles. It was about her. She stepped forward, the click of her shoes on the hardwood floor echoing in the stillness. Her eyes met his face again, his features contorted in pain. This wasn't about him being a billionaire CEO or a man who had treated her like a pawn. This was about her moral obligation, her belief that all people deserved dignity, no matter who they were, no matter what power they held. Maya reached for her phone, ready to call for help. As she did, she realized that her decision wasn't about saving him. It was about her standing up for what she believed in, even when the world told her she didn't matter. She made the call, and in that small, decisive moment, Maya chose to be more than just a witness. She chose to act at the door to Charles' world had opened, and she had stepped through it. What happened next was out of her hands, but she had taken control of her own fate. Charles' breath was the only sound in the room, shallow and ragged like the desperate gasps of a man drowning. Maya knelt beside him, her fingers brushing his clammy skin, trying to gauge his condition. His eyes were barely open, flickering in and out of focus, his body twitching with spasms. The man who had once commanded rooms with a single look was now helpless, a stranger to his own body. Maya swallowed hard. This wasn't what she had expected when she stepped into this room. It was supposed to be a simple, strange task, not this life-or-death emergency. Her stomach twisted, but she pushed the panic down. There was no room for that right now, not with him so close to the edge. Her thoughts flickered back to her childhood, to the days spent caring for her sick mother, to the times she had been the one responsible for someone else's survival. Those years hadn't been easy. They hadn't been fair, but they had taught her something. How to stay calm in a storm. How to think clearly when everything around her was chaos. Maya's hands moved quickly, her fingers assessing his pulse, his skin temperature, his labored breathing. It was worse than she had feared. His pulse was erratic, unsteady, as though his heart itself was losing the battle to keep him alive. The room seemed colder now, the silence pressing in on her as she tried to make sense of what was happening. His breathing sounded wet, labored. Something wasn't right. Maya's eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, that could help. Her gaze landed on a small bottle of pills on the bedside table. It was just sitting there, next to an empty glass of water, like an innocent object in a place that now felt dangerous. She reached for the bottle, lifting it carefully. The label was faded, the words nearly illegible, but the shape of the bottle, the size of the pills, it looked familiar. Too familiar. The cold realization hit her in a wave. The bottle wasn't just for any medication. It was a high-dose prescription drug, something that should have been administered with extreme caution. The pills were likely what had pushed him over the edge. An overdose. Her heart skipped. Was this intentional? Had Charles taken too many on purpose? Or was it just an unfortunate mistake? Either way, it didn't matter now. He was slipping fast, and she needed to act. She stared at the pills for a moment, a surge of fear rising in her chest. Was it too late? Could she save him? The options raced through her mind, but there was no time to weigh them all. Maya's mind flashed back to her mother, to the days when she had been forced to make decisions without guidance, without help. She had learned then that waiting could cost someone their life, that in moments like this, you either acted or you failed. But even as she made the decision, doubt crept in. Was she the right person to do this? Was she even qualified? She was just a waitress, a woman of color, in a world that didn't often see her as capable. But here, in this room, with a life on the line, those things didn't matter. It was her hands, her choices, her actions that would decide the outcome. She looked down at him. His face was pale, drawn tight with pain. His eyes fluttered open again, meeting hers with a flicker of recognition. But there was no time for words. His strength was almost gone. Maya knew what she had to do. Her fingers worked quickly, carefully opening the bottle of pills. She counted them in her mind, her breath steady despite the pounding in her chest. She poured out just enough to balance the risk, the right amount to stabilize him without overdosing him further. Her hands were steady as she reached for the glass of water, her movements practiced from years of caring for others. She knew this wasn't the same as caring for her family, but in some ways, it felt just as important. She helped him swallow the pills, her voice soft but firm as she told him to stay with her. Stay with her. Charles. As the minutes passed, Maya remained by his side, watching his chest rise and fall, her every sense trained on his condition. There was no turning back now. She had made her choice, and as she sat there, waiting, her mind cleared in a way it hadn't in a long time. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She wasn't just a woman who had been forced to survive in a world that often didn't care about her. She was someone who had stepped up when it mattered most. The crisis wasn't over, but in that moment Maya understood something important. She could handle whatever came next. The clock ticked on. The room was too quiet. Only Charles' labored breaths filled the space between them. Maya's hands moved quickly, checking his pulse, adjusting the pillow under his head, and wiping the sweat from his forehead. The sound of his breath, shallow and weak, kept time with the pounding of her heart. She had acted fast. The pills she'd given him, would they be enough? She glanced at his face, his features drawn tight with pain. His usual arrogance was gone now, replaced by a vulnerability she had never expected to see in him. The man who had commanded respect and power with a single glance was now at her mercy. But there was something else there, too. Something in the way he was struggling to breathe, the way his eyes fluttered open, desperate for a glimpse of control. Maya could see it, the fear in his eyes, hidden beneath the layers of his previous self-assurance. She could have walked away. She could have called for help and left it to someone else. But her own past, the weight of every unfair choice that had ever been made for her, held her in place. She had lived too much of her life letting others decide what she deserved. Not anymore. Her mind drifted back to her childhood, to the small apartment where her mother had struggled to make ends meet. Maya had been the one to take on the responsibility, getting her younger siblings ready for school, cleaning up the house, making sure the lights stayed on. Her mother had always said that they didn't have the luxury of mistakes. If they wanted to get ahead, they had to fight for it. There were always barriers, always people who told them no. Maya had learned early that the world wasn't fair, that people like her were expected to work harder for less. And no matter how many jobs she picked up, how many hours she worked, there would always be someone telling her she wasn't enough. She had learned to survive in a world that didn't always value her, but it wasn't enough to just survive anymore. She glanced at the man on the bed again. Charles had always been the one who made the rules. His world was one where people obeyed, where power and wealth were the currency. He had never faced a moment like this, a moment when his control over everything, his money, his reputation, meant nothing. Here, in this room, he was just another human being, vulnerable and exposed. The rules didn't work here. Maya knew what it was like to feel powerless, to be told your worth was defined by the color of your skin, by your job, by your circumstances. She had been a part of a system that used her, and others like her, to fuel the success of men like Charles. But now, in this room, in this moment, she was the one who had control. It was an uncomfortable feeling, a strange power that didn't fit neatly with what she had always known. Her hand hovered over his chest as she assessed his breathing again. The decision was there, waiting for her. She could step back, call for help, and let someone else take over. She could walk away from it all and go back to her life. But something inside her said no. Something inside her knew that this moment was more than just saving Charles Donovan's life. It was about her, about reclaiming something she had lost the right to choose. Maya's mind was a tangle of thoughts, a mess of memories and doubts. What would happen to her if she stayed? What would happen to her if she walked away? She couldn't answer that yet. But she knew one thing. She wasn't going to be afraid. Anymore, she wasn't going to let a man like Charles define what she could or couldn't do. She wasn't going to let anyone diminish her. The moment stretched out, heavy and suffocating, as she stared down at Charles. He needed her, but she needed herself too. This wasn't just about saving him. This was about her taking a stand in a world that had always tried to push her down. The decision was hers, and she made it. She moved, steadying her breath, taking the final step to reclaim control over this moment. She was going to help him, but in doing so, she was helping herself. The chapter ended with the sound of her voice, soft but firm, calling out into the room. "You're going to make it. Stay with me." And for the first time, Maya realized that saving Charles wasn't just about helping him survive, it was about her survival, too. The seconds felt like minutes as Maya stood over Charles, watching his shallow breaths stutter in the quiet room. His skin, once a mask of control and power, was now pale, slick with sweat. The air in the room was thick, heavy with the weight of uncertainty. Maya's heart pounded in her chest as her mind raced. She had done everything she could, but his condition was getting worse. She had already given him the medication, but it hadn't worked. His pulse was weak, his breaths labored. The clock was ticking, and every second felt like a countdown. Maya looked at the man she barely knew, the man who had ordered her into this room, demanding her presence with no regard for her life or safety. The contrast between her life and his was impossible to ignore. She stood there in her worn waitress uniform, the black apron a stark symbol of her reality, working endless shifts, scraping by, living in a world where the rich played by different rules. Around her, the penthouse gleamed with excess, the sleek, polished furniture, the fine art hanging on the walls, everything screamed of privilege and power. But in this moment, it was just a room, and inside it, there was nothing but a man struggling to breathe. Charles muttered something incoherent, his eyes barely open. The words were jumbled, almost impossible to make out. His fear was evident, though. It leaked through the cracks in his tough exterior. For all his wealth, for all his power, he was just like everyone else, now a person desperate to survive. Maya's hands shook slightly as she reached for his pulse again. Her fingers pressed against his neck, feeling the uneven beats of his heart. The cold, impersonal walls of the penthouse seemed to close in on her as she realized the gravity of the situation. She was responsible for him now, for a man who had never thought twice about using others for his gain. A man who had seen her as little more than a servant, a means to an end. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to step away and call for help. The logic was simple. This was his mess, not hers. But she couldn't bring herself to move. She had seen too much in her life to let someone suffer when she had the power to do something about it. The stakes had become too high. Her mother's voice echoed in her head, the way she had always said that the world would break you if you let it. Maya had learned early that if you didn't take control, others would. The world might have told her she didn't matter, that her worth was defined by her job, her skin, her place in society. But here, in this moment, she could rewrite the narrative. Maya inhaled deeply, her resolve hardening like steel. She couldn't let the world's rules dictate her actions anymore. She wasn't just helping Charles, she was helping herself too. She wasn't going to be a passive observer any longer. With shaking hands, Maya adjusted the medication, knowing she had only one chance to get it right. The room was too quiet now, except for the sound of his ragged breathing and her own steadying breath. She administered the necessary treatment, her movements decisive. There was no more time for doubt. The weight of the decision hung in the air. Was it enough? Would it be too late? Maya stepped back, watching Charles closely, her heart thumping in her chest. The clock was ticking. Would it be enough to save him, or had she waited too long? Charles stirred, his eyelids fluttering as he slowly regained consciousness. The stark whiteness of the room blurred in and out of focus, his body heavy, as though he were waking from a long, suffocating dream. His first breath was labored, but it was enough to let him know he had made it. He had survived. Maya sat nearby, her presence quiet, almost unnoticed. She had done what she had to do. She had saved him, but it wasn't a moment to celebrate. He was still weak, fragile. The image of a man who had once commanded everything now lying at the mercy of another. His eyes found hers, and for the first time, the unspoken arrogance that had always defined him was gone. Instead, there was something softer, almost vulnerable in his gaze. He recognized her, the woman who had stepped in when he had needed someone, anyone. She had taken control of the moment, forced the world to bend to her will, even when it felt like she had no power to do so. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice rough. The words were simple, but they carried weight, a recognition of the magnitude of what she had done for him. Maya didn't respond right away. Her silence was enough. The contrast between them lingered. She was a woman of little means, barely scraping by, and he was a man whose wealth could change lives in an instant. He had always lived in a world where power was everything, where decisions were made behind closed doors and with a snap of his fingers. But now, lying in his expensive penthouse, helpless, his life had been saved by the very person who had no reason to care for him. The room felt smaller now, the power dynamics shifting in ways neither of them could have predicted. Charles, still gathering his strength, attempted to sit up, his hand reaching toward the bedside table. He fumbled, then finally took hold of a glass of water, offering it to Maya. "Here," he said, his voice weaker now. "You saved my life. Let me at least thank you properly." Maya's eyes flickered to the glass, the offer of gratitude sitting between them like an unspoken contract. The gesture was kind, but it wasn't what she needed. She had no interest in his thanks. No amount of gratitude would erase the past. No amount of water would wash away the weight of the inequality that had always defined their relationship. She shook her head, declining without a word. The glass remained untouched, a symbol of the divide between them. She didn't need his thanks. She didn't need him to feel indebted. What she needed was her own agency, her own power, to be more than just a vessel for others' control. "I'm fine," Maya said simply. "You'll be okay now." The words were steady, final. She had done what she came to do, but that didn't change who she was or who he was. She stood, the movement purposeful. There was a shift in her, an understanding of what she had just done, and what it meant for her. Maya's decision to leave was not just about walking out of a room. It was about reclaiming something for herself, something she hadn't even known she had lost. She wasn't going to be anyone's pawn, not anymore. She wasn't going to be defined by the expectations of the rich or the powerful. She was walking out of the penthouse. But she was also walking into a new life, one where her actions had meaning, one where her dignity could never again be ignored. As she crossed the threshold of the apartment, stepping into the elevator, the weight of the past few hours settled on her shoulders. She had acted, and she had acted decisively. She had saved Charles' life, but she had also saved herself from a life of silence and submission. The elevator doors closed, but Maya's mind was already far from the penthouse. She knew the choice she had made would change everything for her. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about claiming her own story. As the elevator descended, Maya knew something had shifted. The world was still out there, but she wasn't the same. She wasn't just the waitress. She was someone who could take control of her life, of her decisions, and that was all she needed. Charles Donovan sat in his sleek glass-walled office, overlooking the city that had once felt like his command. The skyscrapers below seemed like towering monuments to his success. He had built this empire, brick by brick, from nothing, or so he had always believed. But as he watched the endless flow of people below moving, existing, doing what they had to do, he felt something shift inside him. The image of Maya's face in the dimly lit room, her steady hands saving his life, kept haunting him. She wasn't like the others. She hadn't needed to care about him, and yet she had. He had known power his whole life. The power to dictate, to control, to take what he wanted. But he had never experienced real vulnerability before until now. The days that followed his collapse had given him time to reflect, and what he found was unsettling. His wealth, his power, the empire he had spent decades building, all of it suddenly seemed hollow. In the space of a few minutes, his life had been teetering on the edge, and it wasn't money or influence that had saved him. It had been Maya, a woman he had once seen as nothing more than an employee, a servant in his world of luxury. Maya had seen him at his most vulnerable, and he could no longer ignore the way she had looked at him. Not with fear or awe, but with something else, agency. She had made a choice to save him, but more than that, she had shown him that her life was not bound by the same rules that governed his. Sharp knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He looked up, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He had made the call, the decision to offer her something in return for what she had done. His assistant entered, her face neutral. "Ms. Fields is here." Maya stepped into his office, her uniform still simple, but there was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself now. She had always carried herself with dignity, but there was something different about her now. She was no longer just a waitress, no longer just someone who took orders. "Ms. Fields," he began, his voice calm but with an edge of uncertainty. "I wanted to thank you again for what you did. You saved my life." She nodded once, her eyes meeting his without flinching. "I did what I had to do." Charles hesitated, his mind grappling with the significance of her words. "I've been thinking," he said, shifting in his chair. "You have qualities that go beyond what I expected. You have a strength, a clarity. I'd like to offer you a position at my company, a real one, not just waiting tables. You could be a part of something bigger." Maya's expression didn't change. She was still, her gaze sharp, weighing his words. He watched her carefully, waiting for her to accept, to be impressed by the offer. But Maya's thoughts were far from his world of titles and power. She knew what he was offering, an opportunity to climb the ladder in a system that had always been designed for people like him to succeed. Her silence stretched for a moment, the weight of her decision pressing on her shoulders. Then she spoke, her voice steady and resolute. "I appreciate the offer, but it's not what I need," she said, each word clear and deliberate. "A job title, no matter how big, won't change what we are. I'm not interested in a seat at a table that was never meant for people like me." Charles flinched, the sharpness of her rejection catching him off guard. He had offered her everything: opportunity, wealth, a chance to be part of something he thought would matter. But Maya had seen it for what it was, an illusion. The contrast between their worlds couldn't have been clearer. Charles had spent his life chasing power, surrounded by luxury, by people who told him he was entitled to it all. But for Maya, it wasn't about climbing to the top. It was about holding on to something more fundamental: her dignity, her independence, her sense of self. She turned to leave, her back straight, her steps confident. "I'm going to be just fine on my own, Mr. Donovan," she said over her shoulder, her voice firm. "I'll make my own way." Charles sat back in his chair, the echo of her words lingering in the air. He watched her leave, the door closing softly behind her. The world outside his office was still bustling with life, but something had shifted. The power he had always known felt distant now, and for the first time, he wondered what it truly meant to be in control. As Maya walked out of the building, she knew the decision to leave was more than just turning down a job offer. It was a declaration. She wasn't going to be defined by what others thought of her. She was choosing her own path, on her own terms, and no amount of wealth or power would ever change that. The city stretched out before her, vast and uncertain, but she was ready. She had her dignity, and that was all she needed. The weight of the city pressed down on Maya as she stepped out of the subway, the familiar hum of life swirling around her. The streets were as busy as ever, the world unchanged. Yet, for her, Everything felt different. It had only been a few days since she had left Charles Donovan's penthouse, but the events that had unfolded had changed something inside her. She had been forced to confront more than just a life or death moment. She had confronted herself. For the first time, Maya understood the true weight of her own agency, the power she held, not in money or status, but in the choices she made every day. She had chosen not to be a passive participant in her own life. She had chosen to take action when it mattered, and in doing so, she had found strength she hadn't known she had. But despite the clarity she had gained, the world outside seemed indifferent to her transformation. People hurried past her, lost in their own lives, none of them knowing the weight she now carried. She wasn't just a waitress anymore, but her life, her worth was still defined by others. She adjusted her bag, feeling the familiar weight of it on her shoulder, a reminder of all the things she still had to do: pay the rent, take care of her family, keep pushing forward. The life she had before Charles was still there, waiting for her, but it no longer felt like enough. She had learned something important in those hours spent in the penthouse, something about dignity, about not letting the world dictate her worth. Maya's thoughts wandered back to Charles. His face had been different after the crisis, softer, humbled in a way she never thought possible. She had seen him a man who had built his empire on control and manipulation, reduced to nothing, at the mercy of his own fragility. It had shaken him, but had it changed him? She didn't know. She didn't need to know. She had her own life to live now. Charles had made his offer, extending the hand of opportunity, but Maya knew better. She had rejected it because she knew that no amount of money, no title, could erase the power imbalance between them. The offer had been a gesture, an acknowledgement of what she had done, but it wasn't what she needed. What she needed was to reclaim her life on her own terms, to refuse to be defined by anyone else's expectations. The clinking of her shoes against the pavement pulled her from her thoughts. She was nearing the building where it all began. The towering structure of glass and steel loomed ahead, a monument to everything she had learned to reject. It was a reminder of a world that had tried to define her. As she stood there, facing the building once more, something inside her stirred. Her fingers brushed against something in her pocket. A small key, the one Charles had offered her for his office, rested against her palm. It had been a gesture of power, a symbol of his world and his control. She had kept it at first, as a reminder of what she had done and what she had refused. Now it felt like nothing more than an empty token dot with a quiet resolution. Maya stopped in front of the building and held the key up to the light for a moment, watching the way it caught the sunlight. Then, in one swift motion, she tossed it into the air. It spun once, twice, before landing in the gutter below, disappearing into the stream of traffic. Just another discarded thing in the city's endless flow. For the first time, Maya didn't look back. The key was gone, but the weight it represented had vanished with it. She was no longer tethered to a world that hadn't ever truly seen her. She didn't need it. She had learned the hard way that true dignity didn't come from titles or wealth. It came from the quiet strength to walk away, to make your own choices, and to never let anyone take that power from you. As she continued down the street, Maya felt lighter than she had in years. She had walked away from Charles, from his world, and in doing so, had reclaimed her future. The city still hummed around her, indifferent to the small, yet monumental, shift that had taken place within her. The story of power and vulnerability had unfolded, not just in the penthouse, but in the quiet moments where Maya had taken back control. She knew the cost of maintaining dignity in a world where it was too easy to lose. But now, she was living proof that dignity could be reclaimed on her own terms, and as she disappeared into the crowd, she knew that, no matter what the world had in store for her, she would always have that choice.